Oh, this is Dr. Greg Parsons, and this is a presentation on academic writing. Now, this isn't a complete instructional set, it's simply an overview and provides kind of the basic elements that we're looking at. So, we're talking about what it is and how it's different from other styles of writing, as well as some of the elements, some of the processes about how it's done and what makes it different from other styles of writing. So first of all, what is it? Well, it's a specialized style of writing used in academics to communicate with each other, and generally for graduate students, especially at the doctoral level, they'll be following a specific style of writing to submit their papers. There are certain rules that should be followed and conventions that make their papers fit into the standard approach that academics use in writing. Also, you'll hear the term academic or scholarly writing used interchangeably. I tend to prefer academic writing, but a lot of papers will talk about scholarly writing. They're the same thing. And so you need to know how to do it because eventually you want to be able to enter into the conversation with other scholars in a particular field. You want to be able to contribute to the academic journals where knowledge is being created. So you need to know the rules to be able to enter into that conversation. In general, not always, but in general, academic writing uses what's called argumentative style. And what you do is the author comes up with an idea and then argues, presents a line of thinking and reasoning and evidence to promote a new idea on a particular topic. So academic writing isn't simply copying information from one place and then rephrasing it and putting it in another place. Telling me something that somebody else wrote verbatim is not the idea of academic writing. The purpose of academic writing is to create a new idea, but not just an opinion, but to provide the evidence, kind of like a lawyer provides the evidence to show that their theory about the guilt or innocence of a client is the right idea. And it's used in all academic fields. But it may be different. Some are more technically oriented, some are less technically oriented. So depending on the academic field you're looking at, they will be using a style of scholarly writing that fits into the general guidelines that I'll be talking about here. But if you pick up a paper from an economics journal, it would look different than a paper from a management journal, and it would look different than a paper on physics, and it would look different than a paper on, for example, French literature. So the papers are going to look somewhat different because of the nature of the field and the evidence that's being provided. But the idea of you're taking a point of view, you're taking a position, and then you try to argue that particular position that you're right with the evidence that you have available. So it's important because in a doctoral program you don't have quizzes and you don't have multiple choice exams. You write papers and you write in discussion posts. So writing is the means of communication. So the basics of what I call evidence-based argument is you start out with a point of view or a purpose or a proposition, whatever you want to call it. The writer has to know what the paper is about, and they state what the paper is going to be about in the thesis statement, which should happen near the beginning of the paper. Okay, so it's important that each paper have a thesis statement where the writer states, this is what the purpose of this paper is. This is my point of view. And then the argument follows that. The argument is then going to be based upon a series of major and minor points, okay, supported by evidence, okay, that's going to support the thesis statement. The evidence is going to come from outside sources. So, for example, we make use of peer-reviewed journal articles from peer-reviewed journals, or it might come from an analysis of some data that's been collected. So the evidence is going to be a variety of information that can be validated, okay, to support the argument. So all papers should have this in them. This is called argumentative, or sometimes called the persuasive style of academic writing. Okay. And generally this is what you'll be doing in your papers. Now, if you don't want to take my word for it, you could go to the Purdue OWL online writing lab and see what they say about it. So argumentative essay is a genre of writing that requires a student to investigate a topic, collect, generate, and evaluate evidence, and establish a position on the topic in a concise manner. That would be our thesis statement. Then the structure of the argumentative essay is held together by clear, concise thesis statement, occurs in the first paragraph, logical transitions between the body and the introduction and the conclusion of the paper. Okay. Transitions are the glue or the mortar that holds the argument together. Then the paragraphs in the body of the paper will include the evidential support, so reference to the journal articles. Evidential support could be factual, logical, statistical, anecdotal, but you have to have evidence. We prefer to have peer-reviewed journal evidence. And then the paper must have a conclusion that doesn't simply restate the thesis, but readdresses what the purpose of the paper was in the light of the evidence that's been provided throughout the body of the paper. Okay, so this is a professional writing lab. This is their definition. So let's take an example. Here's a paper from a strategic management class, and the first thing we want to look for is what's the thesis statement. So in this case, Barney's thesis statement is, here I examine each of the major issues raised by Priam and Butler about my 1991 article and subsequent resource-based research. Well, it turns out that Priam and Butler's direct criticisms are unfounded. They do remind resource-based researchers of some of the important requirements of this type of research. So he said what his point of view is. He says he's going to refute the arguments raised by Priam and Butler in another article. And now how is he going to do that? I will show this by examining the four major criticisms. Okay, so he said what his point of view is, what his perspective is. He said what the purpose of the paper is. He said now how he's going to argue that perspective, that point of view. And then he launches into the body of the paper with the first section where he's going to examine the tautological critique of his earlier paper. Okay, so it's nice and well structured. There's an introduction, then we go into the body of the paper. It's divided up into segments, and there's headings that tell the reader what each section is going to do. So then we move along, and we now move to a subsection where he's talking about parameterizing values, but he connects the previous paragraph to the next paragraph by saying, in the next sections I examine the extent to which each of the components of this resource-based theory are parameterized in ways that can generate testable propositions. Okay, so he said, now I'm going to talk about parameterization. The first one is parameterizing value. Clearly all the theory elements of the 1991 article, the value variable is the least fully parameterized. Okay, so he's done a transition where he connects the previous section to the next section. So the reader has a smooth flow in the logic he's presenting. And again, you see how things are divided up into sections with section headings. Now we also have transitions between paragraphs. So he finishes one paragraph by saying, indeed, since 1991, work has continued on using these kinds of models to estimate resource value. And then using the same word, work, this work falls into two categories. So you see that he's going to a new idea, but he's connected the ideas together by stating work in the previous paragraph and then using this work again, which connects it together. So you know he's referring to the same thing he was talking about earlier. Then also we need transitions between major sections. So here he says, thus Priam and Butler demonstrate that it is possible to restate the 1991 argument as if it were tautological, but they fail to demonstrate that the argument is in fact tautological. Indeed, it's possible to derive empirically testable assertions from the 1991 article, assertions that have in fact been tested. Okay, so now he's finishing up a major section, and now he's going to go into the next section of equifinality. So he sums up the tautological section and now moves on to equifinality as the next major part of his argument. He talks, although Priam and Butler do not label it as a major limitation of our BV, they do suggest that another weakness of this logic is developed is the problem of equifinality. All right, so he's tied both of these together. He shows how they relate to each other. Okay, and everything ties back to what he said he was going to do in his thesis statement. There's a reason why he puts the information in there, because it's in support of his thesis. Now we come down to the conclusion, and he restates what the purpose was, that he was going to refute Priam and Butler's argument that his article was not valid. And so he summarizes some of the things that Priam and Butler said, and then he goes on to add some future direction. So he says he would like to go back and look over some of the things, the comments they made, and perhaps find some ways to improve his original article based upon research that's been done subsequently. Okay, so everything ties together in a academic paper. There's an introduction, which states what the purpose of the paper is. There's a body of the paper, which is made up of different sections which contain different elements of the argument. There's a evidence supplied through references to information from other journal articles. And so he's built his argument, and in the conclusion summarizes what the purpose of the paper was, and then comes back to tell us, and this is what I showed you throughout the paper. And now he can point to some new things that could be done. And you see also he has a reference list of all the support that he used, all the evidence he used in his argument. So let's look at some of the basic elements in scholarly writing. First, there's structure. Every paper needs to have an introduction. Now, APA formatting says you don't need to write the term introduction as a heading. It's implied that the first section of the paper, before the body of the paper starts, will be the introduction and won't need a heading. However, I generally like students in this class to write introduction to remind themselves that the first section of the paper is the introduction, in which you're supposed to put the purpose of the paper, the thesis statement, a general roadmap about how the body of the paper is going to be organized. Then the body of the paper should again start with a heading indicating what the different sections are that you're going to be writing about, what the major and minor points are. Okay, so there'll be major sections and minor sections, and there will be headings appropriate to those. There'll be a conclusion to remind the reader what the point of the paper was, why the paper was written, and then how the argument was developed through the body of the paper. So structure is extremely important. It's like the skeleton. If you don't have a skeleton, a human body would just be a pile of flesh on the floor. The skeleton is what holds it all together. So I always recommend, before you write a paper, make an outline of your major ideas, organize that outline, and when you finalize the outline, that outline should then become the structure of your paper. That's the way it should be written, and it should be broken up into sections with headings. The style of writing needs to be semi-formal. The vocabulary that's used, it may not be as formal as some other fields in the social sciences, but it still needs to be appropriate. You write in an objective perspective, you use clear and precise language, and you avoid mechanical errors such as spelling and grammar, which we would expect. At a doctoral level, you should not turn in papers that have poor grammar or that have misspelled words. And you have your APA manual to help you with some of the formatting and guidelines. The logic of the paper, remember you're writing a paper to argue a particular point, or a particular point, and you'll be using deductive reasoning, so you'll be building your argument based upon the references that you have available. Major sections are built upon minor sections, and minor sections are built upon paragraphs, and those should all tie together with transitions. The style of writing is evidence-based argument, and the quality of the evidence is going to be based upon the sources that you use. So for example, here's a pyramid of different types of evidence that would be used. So for example, the weakest evidence is at the bottom where we see it's expert opinion, and then above that we have case report, then retrospective, and then controlled clinical study and randomized controlled trial. So all the way up to the top where the evidence is strongest. Now, this has to do with when you would be going out collecting data to support your thesis. But what we'll be using mostly is secondary literature, secondary information that's been published in the peer-reviewed journal articles. But even those articles, those journals are rated with regards to their relevance and strength. So there'll be A-rated journals, the top quality journals, there'll be B quality journals, there'll be C quality journals. And we'll talk more about this later, about gathering your information, where it should come from. Other elements of scholarly writing is the audience. You have to keep in mind who you're going to be writing for and understand their needs. Generally, I say, you know, I may know the subject you're writing about quite well, but you have to write for an audience that doesn't know it so well. You also need to use synthesis, which is not simply copying information from one place and putting it in another, but it's using the information to develop new insight. Okay, so we're looking for new ideas. We're looking for critical thinking. Okay, not opinion, but critical thinking about the existing research that's already been done. And then you'll learn to use voice, to blend others' voice, that would be your reference material, from writer's voice, which is what you want to say about it. The process is one of planning, really. So you have to prepare, set a plan, then you have to research, then you finally have to write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. So the key, my personal advice to successful writing, is write fast and revise often. Repeat until done. And in the end, you learn to write by writing. There's no substitute for practice. And so the more you do it, and that's why we have a lot of papers scheduled, the more you do it, the better you'll get at it. So, and I like the quote here that you can't think yourself out of a writing block, you have to write yourself out of a thinking block. Well, again, this was not meant to be an instructional video. It was meant more of as an overview and to introduce the subject, and then we'll be looking at specific parts of the process, specific exercises to work on that will develop these particular skills that you need. Well, until later, goodbye and good luck.